The morning of February 14th, 1987, Deputy Sheriff Jack Brennan pulled his cruiser onto the long gravel driveway leading to the Wallace farmhouse, his tires crunching through 8 inches of fresh snow. The storm that had battered Crawford County, Wisconsin for 3 days straight had finally moved east, leaving behind a landscape so white and silent it felt like the world had been erased. Brennan had received the call from Helen Crowley, the Wallace family's closest neighbor, who lived 2 miles down County Road M. She'd grown worried when she hadn't seen any smoke rising from their chimney, and when she'd driven over after the roads cleared, she'd found something that made her hands shake so badly she could barely dial the sheriff's office. Brennan stepped out of his vehicle and immediately noticed what had alarmed Helen. The Wallace house stood perfectly intact, smoke absent from the chimney, but tracks in the snow told a strange story. There were no footprints leading away from the house, no tire marks except his own and Helen's. The front door was unlocked. He pushed it open, calling out for Robert Wallace, his wife Linda, and their 3 children. Silence answered him. The house felt wrong, not just empty, but frozen in a moment that shouldn't exist. In the kitchen, the dining table was set for breakfast, 4 plates arranged with precision. Scrambled eggs sat congealed on a serving platter in the center of the table. Toast had gone cold in a basket covered with a checkered cloth. A pitcher of orange juice stood next to 5 glasses, 3 of them child-sized. The coffee pot on the counter was half full, stone cold. Before you continue with this story, I want to ask you to do something that really helps this channel grow. Please take a moment to subscribe and leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from. It means the world to me and helps me bring you more stories like this one. Now let's get back to what Deputy Brennan discovered that February morning. Brennan walked through the house methodically, documenting everything he saw. In the living room, the television was off, but the lamp beside the couch was still on, its weak bulb casting yellow light across family photographs on the mantel. Robert and Linda's bedroom showed an unmade bed, Linda's reading glasses folded on the nightstand next to a romance novel with a bookmark halfway through. In the children's rooms, he found beds that looked slept in, rumpled sheets and pillows still holding the indentations of small heads. 8-year-old Grace's stuffed rabbit lay on her bed. The twins, Jeremy and Joshua, both 6, had toy cars scattered across their shared bedroom floor. Every light in the house was on, as if the family had simply vanished mid-morning. Brennan's instincts, honed over 15 years in law enforcement, told him something catastrophic had happened, but the scene defied logic. He radioed for backup, and within 2 hours, the farmhouse became the center of an intensive investigation. Sheriff Tom Hendricks arrived with 4 additional deputies, and by afternoon, the Wisconsin State Police had sent 2 detectives. They photographed everything, dusted for prints, and searched the property for any sign of struggle or forced entry. They found none. Robert Wallace's truck sat in the detached garage, covered in a light dusting of snow that had blown through gaps in the wooden walls. Linda's sedan was parked beside it, both vehicles cold, neither driven recently. The barn behind the house held 3 dairy cows that hadn't been milked in days, their distressed lowing carrying across the frozen fields. The chickens in the coop were hungry but alive. Every animal on the property had been neglected, which was completely unlike Robert, a 3rd-generation farmer known throughout Crawford County for his meticulous care of his livestock. Helen Crowley sat in her kitchen 2 miles down the road, giving her statement to Detective Paul Rivera from the state police. She'd known the Wallace family for 12 years, ever since Robert and Linda had bought the farm from old Edwin Garrett's estate. She described them as good people, devoutly religious, always at Sunday services at Prairie Creek Baptist Church. Robert was quiet but friendly, the kind of man who'd help you pull your car from a ditch without expecting anything in return. Linda had taught 2nd grade at Prairie Creek Elementary until Joshua and Jeremy were born. Then she'd stayed home with the children. The kids were bright, Well-behaved, always polite when they came to Helen's house selling Girl Scout cookies or collecting for school fundraisers. "Did they have any enemies?" Rivera asked, his pen poised over his notepad. Helen shook her head firmly. "Enemies? Robert? Linda? No, Detective, you don't understand. These were the last people who'd have enemies. They kept to themselves mostly, but they were kind. Linda brought me soup when I had pneumonia last year. Robert plowed my driveway every winter without me even asking." She paused, her weathered hands wrapped around a coffee mug. "Something bad happened to them. I can feel it. You don't just leave breakfast on the table and disappear. You don't leave your children's beds unmade and your animals unfed. Something took them. Or someone did." Rivera thanked her and drove back to the Wallace farm as the winter sun began its early descent. The temperature was already dropping, forecast to hit 5 below zero by midnight. Inside the farmhouse, forensic technicians worked in the artificial warmth provided by space heaters they'd brought with them. They'd collected fingerprints from every surface, bagged the breakfast food as evidence, and searched for any trace of blood or signs of violence. They found nothing that suggested foul play, which only deepened the mystery. Sheriff Hendricks stood in the kitchen, staring at that table with its cold breakfast, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Wisconsin winter. In 23 years of law enforcement, he'd never seen anything like this. People didn't just vanish from locked houses with their breakfast still warm, but the Wallace family had done exactly that. By evening, the investigation expanded beyond the farmhouse. Deputies and volunteers began searching the surrounding woods and fields, looking for any trace of the missing family. The snow made it difficult. The storm had deposited nearly 18 inches across the county, and the wind had created drifts that reached 4 and 5 feet in some places. Search dogs were brought in from Madison, German shepherds trained to track human scent. They circled the house, picked up trails, and then lost them within 50 yards of the property, as if the family had simply ceased to exist once they left the immediate vicinity of their home. The handlers couldn't explain it. One of them, a veteran tracker named Dale Putnam, told Hendricks he'd never seen the dogs act so confused. News of the disappearance spread quickly through the rural community. Prairie Creek had a population of just under 2,000 people, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business. By Sunday, the story had made the regional newspapers, and by Monday, television news crews from Milwaukee and Madison had descended on Crawford County. The Wallace case captured public attention in a way few missing persons cases did. Perhaps it was the children, or the eerie detail of the breakfast table, or the complete absence of any rational explanation. Whatever the reason, the case became a sensation. The state police established a dedicated tip line, and within days they'd received hundreds of calls, most of them useless, some of them cruel. The investigation entered what law enforcement called the intensive phase. Detectives interviewed everyone who knew the Wallace family. They spoke to Robert's brother Daniel, who lived in La Crosse and worked as an accountant. Daniel told them his brother had seemed fine when they'd talked on the phone 2 weeks earlier. Robert had mentioned the forecast, said he was prepared for the storm, had plenty of firewood and food stored up. They'd made plans for Daniel to bring his family to the farm for Easter. Linda's sister, Patricia Hoffman, flew in from Denver, her face drawn with worry and grief. She stayed with Helen Crowley and spent her days at the sheriff's office, demanding answers that no one could provide. Patricia described Linda as a devoted mother, someone who lived for her children. "She would never leave them," Patricia insisted, her voice breaking. "Never, not voluntarily. Someone took them. You have to find who did this." Detectives dug into Robert and Linda's finances, looking for any sign of trouble. They found none. The farm was profitable enough to sustain the family, though money was tight like it was for most small farmers in the region. Robert owed $12,000 on a loan for a new tractor, but the payments were current. Linda had a small savings account with $3,200, money she'd set aside from her teaching days. There were no large withdrawals, no suspicious transactions, no evidence of gambling debts or loan sharks. The couple's phone records showed calls to family members, the feed store, Linda's mother in Green Bay, and the children's pediatrician. Nothing unusual. Nothing that explained why an entire family would vanish without trace. Detective Rivera spent hours at the farmhouse, walking through the rooms, trying to understand the sequence of events. The breakfast table haunted him. Whoever had prepared that meal had been planning for a normal morning. Linda had made scrambled eggs for 5 people. She'd set out juice and coffee. The calendar on the kitchen wall showed a notation for February 14th, Valentine's Day, with a small heart drawn next to it. In the living room, Rivera found Valentine's cards the children had made at school, construction paper hearts with crayon messages. To Mom and Dad, love, Grace. Happy Valentine's Day, Mommy, from Jeremy and Joshua. The cards were propped on the mantel, waiting to be given. What had happened between the time Linda made breakfast and the moment the family ceased to exist in that house? The window was impossibly small, maybe 30 minutes, maybe less. The forensic analysis of the scene provided few answers. The fingerprints found in the house all belonged to family members or known visitors, like Helen Crowley. There were no unknown prints, no signs of forced entry. No indications that anyone outside the immediate family had been in the house during the critical time period. The breakfast food was tested and found to be free of poisons or toxins. The coffee was just coffee. The orange juice was just orange juice. Whatever had happened to the Wallaces, it hadn't involved poisoning. The state crime lab examined the children's beds, the parents' bedroom, every surface in the house, looking for trace evidence. They found nothing useful, just the detritus of normal family life. Pet hair from the family's golden retriever, who'd been found alive in the barn, though neglected. Dust, crumbs, the ordinary residue of ordinary people living ordinary lives until something extraordinary interrupted them. As February turned into March, the investigation began to slow. The initial burst of energy and resources couldn't be sustained indefinitely. The state police had other cases demanding attention. The sheriff's department, small and understaffed, struggled to keep the Wallace case active while handling the county's routine law enforcement needs. Detective Rivera remained committed, spending his own time reviewing the case file, searching for something everyone had missed. He interviewed the Wallace family's pastor, Reverend William Stokes from Prairie Creek Baptist Church. Stokes was a thin man in his 50s with kind eyes and a gentle manner. He'd known the family well, seen them every Sunday, without fail. Robert and Linda were pillars of our congregation, Stokes told Rivera, sitting in his small office adjacent to the church sanctuary. They were faithful, devoted to God and to each other. Linda taught Sunday school for the younger children. Robert served on the deacon board. I can't imagine what would cause them to leave their home, their life. It's unfathomable. Rivera asked if Robert or Linda had seemed troubled recently, if they'd sought counseling or confided any problems. Stokes thought carefully before answering. Linda came to me about 6 weeks before they disappeared. She said she'd been having nightmares, dreams about losing her children. She seemed shaken by them, but I assured her they were just dreams, anxiety that many mothers experience. I prayed with her. She seemed comforted. He paused, his expression pained. Do you think those dreams meant something? Could she have known somehow that danger was coming? Rivera didn't know how to answer that question. He didn't believe in premonitions or psychic warnings, but Linda's nightmares troubled him nonetheless. He asked Stokes if anyone in the congregation had seemed to take an unusual interest in the Wallace family, if there had been any conflicts or disputes. Stokes shook his head. No conflicts. The Wallaces were well liked. If anything, people admired them. They seem to have what everyone wants, a happy marriage, healthy children, a good life. He looked at Rivera with sadness in his eyes. I keep praying they'll be found safe, but as time passes, I fear the worst. Whatever happened to them, I believe it was evil, pure evil. The spring thaw in late March brought renewed search efforts. With the snow melted, volunteers and law enforcement personnel combed the fields and woods surrounding the Wallace farm. They searched abandoned buildings, old wells, ravines and creek beds. They used cadaver dogs, though the handlers warned that months of winter weather would have degraded any scent trail. The searches yielded nothing. No bodies, no clothing, no personal effects. It was as if the Wallace family had been erased from existence. The case began to attract attention from beyond Wisconsin. National news programs featured the disappearance. A segment on unsolved mysteries brought thousands of new tips, most of them worthless, some of them from people claiming to have seen the Wallaces in various locations across the country. Each tip was investigated, and each led nowhere. By summer, the investigation had entered what law enforcement called the sustained phase, a frustrating period when leads dried up and detectives were reduced to waiting for something to break. Rivera couldn't let it go. The case consumed him in ways his wife found worrying. He kept copies of the Wallace family photographs on his desk, studying their faces, searching for some clue in their expressions. Robert was 34 in the most recent photo, a solid man with a farmer's build, dark hair and a reserved smile. Linda was 32, pretty in an understated way, with long brown hair and warm eyes. The children were beautiful, healthy, full of the promise of lives not yet lived. Grace had her mother's eyes. The twins had their father's serious expression. Rivera felt he owed them something, though they'd never met. He owed them the truth. One afternoon in late August, Rivera drove back to the Wallace farm. The house stood empty, slowly falling into disrepair. The bank had foreclosed on the property after 3 missed mortgage payments, though there was little market for a farm where a family had mysteriously vanished. Local superstition had taken hold. People claimed the place was cursed, haunted. Teenagers dared each other to spend nights there, though most lost their nerve before sunset. Rivera walked through the house, now dusty and neglected, and stood in the kitchen where that breakfast table had been found. The table was gone now, taken as evidence and stored in a warehouse, but Rivera could picture it perfectly. 5 plates, cold eggs. A family interrupted. He sat on the porch steps as the August sun beat down, trying to think like the Wallaces had thought that Valentine's Day morning. What had they known? What had they feared? Linda's nightmares about losing her children suggested anxiety. But anxiety about what? Robert had no enemies, no gambling debts, no criminal connections. Linda was a school teacher, beloved by her students and colleagues. The children were innocent by definition. Nothing about the Wallace family suggested they were targets for violence, yet violence, or something equally final, had clearly found them. Rivera's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a vehicle approaching. He turned to see a pickup truck pulling into the driveway. A man in his 60s climbed out, lean and weathered, wearing work clothes and a John Deere cap. He approached cautiously. "You're that detective, aren't you? The one who's been working the Wallace case?" Rivera stood and confirmed his identity. The man extended a calloused hand. "Name's Arnold Lester. I farm the property adjacent to this one, about a mile south through those woods." He gestured toward the tree line. "I've been meaning to come talk to you, but I wasn't sure if what I know matters." Rivera's pulse quickened. Even after months of dead ends, he couldn't help but hope that this time, finally, someone would provide the missing piece. "Anything you can tell me might help, Mr. Lester. Please go on." Lester removed his cap, wiped sweat from his forehead and spoke slowly, choosing his words with care. "About a week before the Wallaces disappeared, I was checking my fence line where it borders their property. It was late afternoon, getting dark. I saw a vehicle parked on an old logging road that runs through the woods between our farms. Logging road hasn't been used in years, all grown over. But there was a vehicle there, a van, dark-colored, maybe blue or black. I couldn't see clearly in the failing light. "Did you see who was in the van?" Rivera asked, pulling out his notebook. Lester shook his head. "No, but I saw someone standing outside it. A man, I think, average height, wearing dark clothes. When he saw me, he got in the van and drove off quick, heading away from the main road, deeper into the woods. It struck me as odd at the time. I mentioned it to my wife, but we didn't think much more about it until the Wallaces went missing. Then I started wondering if it meant something." Rivera pressed him for more details. Did he see a license plate? Could he describe the man more specifically? Lester apologized, but said the distance and the dim light made it impossible. "I should have come forward sooner," he admitted, guilt evident in his voice. "But I wasn't sure if it was related. Lots of folks use those old logging roads for all sorts of reasons, hunting, parking, things they don't want seen. I didn't want to waste your time with something that might be nothing." Rivera assured him it wasn't a waste of time, though privately he acknowledged that the information, while interesting, was too vague to pursue effectively. A dark van in the woods, a week before the disappearance, wasn't evidence of anything criminal. Still, he documented it carefully, added it to the case file. As autumn arrived and then winter returned to Crawford County, the first anniversary of the Wallace disappearance approached. The case remained officially open, but inactive, filed among the growing number of unsolved missing persons cases that haunted law enforcement agencies across the country. Rivera had been reassigned to other investigations, though he still thought about the Wallaces nearly every day. The breakfast table, the unmade beds, the Valentine's cards on the mantel. Patricia Hoffman, Linda's sister, called him monthly, asking if there were any developments. Each time, Rivera had to tell her there were none. He heard the hope dying in her voice, replaced gradually by bitter resignation. In February 1988, exactly 1 year after the disappearance, a memorial service was held at Prairie Creek Baptist Church. Hundreds of people attended, filling the small sanctuary to capacity. Reverend Stokes delivered a eulogy for a family he couldn't quite declare dead, speaking of faith and mystery and the limits of human understanding. Patricia Hoffman broke down sobbing during the service. Daniel Wallace sat stone-faced, his own family gathered around him protectively. Helen Crowley attended, her presence a quiet testimony to friendship and loyalty. Rivera sat in the back pew, feeling the weight of his failure to bring closure to these grieving people. After the service, as people filed out into the cold February afternoon, a woman approached Rivera. She was in her 40s, plainly dressed, with nervous eyes. "Detective Rivera, my name is Margaret Finch. I need to tell you something about Robert Wallace, something I should have told you a year ago." Rivera led her away from the crowd, and they sat in his car for privacy. Margaret explained that she'd worked at the Prairie Creek Agricultural Co-op, where Robert bought feed and supplies. Robert came into the co-op on February 12th, 2 days before they disappeared. He bought supplies like he always did, but he seemed different, agitated. I asked if everything was okay, and he said something strange. He said, "If something happens to me and my family, make sure people know we didn't just run away. We would never leave without telling anyone." I thought it was an odd thing to say, but I laughed it off, told him nothing was going to happen. But then it did happen, and I've been carrying this guilt ever since. Rivera felt adrenaline surge through his system. Did he say why he thought something might happen? Did he mention feeling threatened? Margaret shook her head, tears forming in her eyes. No, he didn't elaborate. I pressed him a little, but he just shook his head and said he had to go. I've replayed that conversation 1,000 times, wondering what I missed, what I should have asked. He knew something was wrong, Detective. He knew, and I didn't take him seriously. This information changed the complexion of the case. Robert had anticipated danger, which meant the disappearance was likely not random or spontaneous. Rivera reopened his investigation with renewed focus, though he was now working largely on his own time, as his superiors had moved on to cases they deemed more solvable. He re-interviewed everyone connected to the Wallace family, this time with a new question. Had Robert or Linda mentioned feeling threatened or afraid in the weeks before they vanished? Most people said no, but a few recalled small details they'd previously thought insignificant. Linda's mother remembered a phone call in late January when Linda had mentioned a strange car parked on their road for several hours. The children's pediatrician recalled that during Joshua's checkup in early February, Linda had seemed distracted and asked if the office kept their medical records secured. At the time, it had seemed like an odd question, but the doctor had assured her the records were confidential. Rivera began constructing a new theory. The Wallaces had been targeted, stalked perhaps, in the weeks before their disappearance. Robert had sensed the danger, hence his comment to Margaret Finch. Linda's anxiety and nightmares suggested she'd felt it too. But who would target a farm family with no obvious enemies, no wealth worth stealing, no secrets worth killing for? Rivera investigated the possibility of mistaken identity, that the Wallaces had been confused with someone else. He looked into organized crime, though Crawford County was far from the urban centers where such operations thrived. He considered the possibility of a random predator, someone who'd fixated on the family for reasons unknowable to rational minds. Years passed. The case grew cold, despite Rivera's efforts. He retired from the state police in 1995, but he took copies of the Wallace case file with him, unable to let go. He'd promised himself that before he died, he would find the answer. In retirement, he had time to pursue leads that the active investigation had never fully explored. He tracked down former residents of Crawford County who'd moved away, asking if they remembered anything unusual from February 1987. He corresponded with FBI profilers, seeking insights into what kind of perpetrator could make an entire family vanish so completely. The profilers suggested someone with detailed knowledge of the area, someone who'd planned meticulously, someone local. In 2001, 14 years after the disappearance, Rivera received a phone call that made his hands shake. It was from a woman named Diane Kruger, calling from a nursing home in Eau Claire. Her father, she explained, had recently died, and while sorting through his belongings, she'd found something disturbing. Her father, Leonard Kruger, had been a long-haul trucker based in western Wisconsin. Among his possessions, Diane had found a small photograph of 3 children, clearly cut from a larger family photo. She'd recognized the children from old news coverage of the Wallace case. The photograph had been hidden in a cigar box, along with other photographs of children, none of whom Diane recognized. Rivera drove to Eau Claire that same day. Diane met him at the nursing home and handed over the cigar box with trembling hands. Inside were dozens of photographs of children, some clearly taken without the subject's knowledge, long-distance shots, or pictures taken through windows. Among them was the cut photograph showing Grace, Jeremy, and Joshua Wallace. On the back, written in faded ink, were 3 names and a date: Grace, Jeremy, Joshua, February 1987. Rivera felt ice in his veins. Leonard Kruger had been dead for 3 weeks. There was no way to question him, no way to know if he'd been responsible for the disappearance, or if he'd merely been a disturbed man who'd collected photographs related to missing children cases. Diane provided Rivera with her father's work logs from 1987, records showing the routes he'd driven. In February 1987, Leonard had made regular runs through southwestern Wisconsin, delivering goods to rural co-ops and farm supply stores. Rivera contacted the FBI and shared this new evidence. Leonard Kruger's name was run through databases of known offenders. He'd never been arrested, never been on law enforcement's radar. His trucking company described him as reliable and quiet, a man who kept to himself. Diane admitted that her father had been emotionally distant, sometimes absent for weeks at a time on long hauls. She'd never suspected him of anything criminal, though she acknowledged he'd been a strange man, prone to dark moods. The FBI seized the contents of Leonard's home, searching for more evidence. They found journals filled with disturbing writings about children, fantasies about control and power. They found maps of Wisconsin with locations marked, including a mark near Crawford County. But they found no confession, no definitive proof that Leonard Kruger had taken the Wallace family. The new evidence allowed investigators to obtain a search warrant for properties Leonard had owned or had access to in 1987. He'd rented a storage unit in Richland Center, about 30 miles from the Wallace farm. The unit had been closed and auctioned off years earlier when Leonard stopped paying rent, but investigators tracked down the auction buyer. Most of the contents had been discarded, but the buyer remembered a large trunk that had been locked. He'd broken the lock and found the trunk empty, except for some rope and a tarp. At the time, he'd thought nothing of it. But now, in the context of the investigation, these items took on sinister significance. Investigators also learned that Leonard Kruger had owned a dark blue van in 1987, the same type of vehicle Arnold Lester had seen on the logging road near the Wallace farm. The van had been sold in 1989, and its current whereabouts were unknown. Rivera felt certainty settling in his gut. Leonard Kruger had taken the Wallace family. The how and why might never be fully understood, but the evidence pointed to him. The FBI's behavioral analysis unit agreed. Kruger fit the profile of a predator who'd stalked the family, learned their routines, and struck during the snowstorm, when the isolation of the farm and the impassable roads had given him time and cover to abduct them without witnesses. But where were the bodies? That question haunted Rivera most of all. The FBI brought in ground-penetrating radar and searched properties Kruger had been associated with in 1987. They found nothing. They dragged quarries and searched abandoned mines. Nothing. It was possible Kruger had disposed of his victims in a location unknown to investigators, some remote spot he'd scouted during his trucking routes. It was possible the Wallace family would never be recovered, never received the burial they deserved. Rivera contacted Patricia Hoffman and Daniel Wallace, now both in their 60s, and shared what investigators had learned. The news brought a measure of closure, though it was bittersweet. They finally had a name, a face to attach to the evil that had destroyed their family. Leonard Kruger, a monster who'd lived an ordinary life while harboring extraordinary darkness. But without bodies, without absolute proof, questions remained. Patricia wanted to believe they finally had answers, but part of her wondered if they'd ever really know what happened in those final moments. Daniel arranged for a second memorial service, this time with the assumption that his brother's family was dead, killed by Leonard Kruger on or shortly after February 14, 1987. In 2003, a farmer plowing a field near the Wisconsin-Iowa border unearthed human remains, skeletal and scattered by years of exposure and animal activity. DNA testing confirmed what Rivera had hoped and feared. The remains belonged to Linda Wallace and her 3 children. Robert's remains were never found, likely lost to the elements or buried in a location that would remain forever unknown. The discovery brought devastating finality to the case. The Wallace family, missing for 16 years, had been found, though not in any way their loved ones had prayed for. A funeral was held in Prairie Creek, and Linda, Grace, Jeremy, and Joshua were laid to rest in the cemetery behind the Baptist church they'd attended so faithfully. Rivera attended the funeral, an old man now, his hair white, his step slower. He'd devoted nearly 2 decades of his life to finding the Wallaces, and though he'd succeeded in a sense, the victory felt hollow. 4 people had been murdered by a man who'd escaped justice by dying before his crimes could be proven. Robert's fate remained unknown, his body never recovered, adding a final layer of tragedy to a case defined by unanswered questions. After the service, Rivera stood at the graveside as the last mourners departed. He placed his hand on Linda's headstone and spoke quietly. "I'm sorry it took so long. I'm sorry I couldn't stop what happened, but I never forgot you. None of you." The Wallace farmhouse was demolished in 2005, torn down by the county after it became a liability, a decaying structure attracting vandals and curiosity seekers. The land was eventually sold and converted to pasture. Nothing remains now to mark the spot where a family sat down to breakfast one Valentine's Day morning and never got to eat it. But in Prairie Creek, the story persists, passed down through generations as a cautionary tale about the fragility of safety and the presence of evil in places that seem immune to it. Helen Crowley, who'd first discovered the empty house, died in 2010 at the age of 92. In her final days, she told her grandchildren about the Wallaces, about how quickly a normal life could be stolen away. She made them promise to look out for one another, to pay attention when something felt wrong, to never assume that bad things only happened to other people. Detective Paul Rivera died in 2012, 5 years after retiring for the second time. His obituary mentioned his work on the Wallace case, the dedication he'd shown to finding a family that most had given up for lost. At his funeral, Patricia Hoffman attended, though she was elderly and frail by then. She thanked Rivera's widow for the years her husband had spent seeking justice for Linda and the children. "He gave us answers when no one else would," Patricia said through tears. "He gave us the truth even though it hurt. That's a gift beyond measure." Oh, the case of the Wallace family remains one of the most haunting disappearances in Wisconsin history, not because it went unsolved, but because of how it was solved and what it revealed about the nature of predatory violence. Leonard Kruger had no connection to his victims beyond proximity and opportunity. He'd seen a family that represented something he wanted to destroy, and he'd destroyed it with methodical precision. The snowstorm had been his ally, providing cover and isolation. The breakfast table, still set with cold food, had been his calling card, a tableau of interruption that spoke to the suddenness with which safety can become terror. In the years since, criminologists and psychologists have studied the Wallace case as an example of predatory stalking behavior. Kruger's journals, analyzed after his death, revealed a man obsessed with control and the corruption of innocence. He'd written about the pleasure he derived from watching families, from inserting himself into their lives without their knowledge. The Wallace family had likely never known they were being watched, never known that their ordinary routines were being studied by someone planning their destruction. This knowledge adds another layer of horror to an already horrific case. They'd been living their last days in ignorance of the fate approaching them, making breakfast and setting tables and tucking children into bed, all while a predator circled closer. Today, if you drive through Crawford County, Wisconsin, past the farms and the small towns and the churches that anchor rural communities, you might pass the land where the Wallace house once stood. There's nothing to see now, just grass and grazing cattle, and the ordinary beauty of farmland in any season. But the story lingers in the collective memory of those who live there, a reminder that evil doesn't announce itself with fanfare, that it can arrive on a snowy morning and steal away everything that matters before breakfast gets cold. The Wallace family deserved better than the fate they received. They deserved to live out their lives, to see their children grow up, to grow old together on the farm they'd worked so hard to build. Instead, they became a cautionary tale, a mystery that took 16 years to solve, a tragedy that time will never completely heal. Patricia Hoffman spent her final years advocating for missing persons' families, using her sister's case to push for better investigative protocols and faster response times when people disappeared. She established a small foundation in Linda's name, providing support and resources to families going through the nightmare of having a loved one vanish without explanation. The foundation still exists, run now by Patricia's children, and it has helped dozens of families navigate the bureaucratic and emotional maze of missing persons investigations. In that sense, some good emerged from the Wallace tragedy, a legacy of advocacy and support that might have comforted Linda if she'd known it would exist. Before her death in 2018, Patricia gave one final interview about her sister and the case that had defined so much of her life. "I want people to remember Linda as she was," Patricia said, her voice steady despite her age and grief. "She was a wonderful mother, a caring teacher, a devoted wife. She was my sister and my friend. What happened to her and her family was evil, but they weren't defined by that evil. They were defined by how they lived, by the love they shared, by the goodness they brought into the world. That's what I want people to remember." The cemetery behind Prairie Creek Baptist Church remains well tended, a peaceful place where generations of local families have been laid to rest. Linda Wallace's grave sits beneath a maple tree, alongside the graves of her 3 children. The headstones are simple, bearing names and dates and a shared inscription: together in life, together in death, together in eternal rest. On Valentine's Day each year, someone, no one knows who, places fresh flowers on the graves, a quiet tribute to a family stolen on a day meant for love. The flowers appear like clockwork, carnations and roses arranged carefully, a gesture of remembrance from someone who refuses to let the Wallaces be forgotten. Perhaps it's one of Linda's former students, now middle-aged, honoring the teacher who made a difference in their childhood. Perhaps it's someone who remembers the case and feels moved to mark the anniversary. Whoever it is, they've maintained this tradition for over 2 decades, ensuring that 4 victims of senseless violence are honored and remembered each year on the day they were taken.